So they have come up with, in the 2019 report, Freedom House comes up with, they have free, partly free, and not free as the standard they use. And the countries which are not, which they don't include as free from the Western Hemisphere, I'm going to read them to you in alphabetical order, are Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Mexico, Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, and Venezuela. Okay? They judge 3 of those to be not free. Okay? Anybody want to tell me which are the 3 not free countries in the Western Hemisphere? Venezuela, very good. Cuba, says Ambassador Huddleston. All right. One of them is one of those Mexican countries in Central America. Yes, way in the back. Nicaragua, of course. Yeah, Nicaragua. And so those are the free, the free, not 3, the 3 not free countries according to Freedom House. And they have 2 countries that they classify as free, but they express particular concern about, countries that are worthy of keeping an eye on. Anybody want to guess what those 2 are? Brazil, very good. And the other one? Who's? The United States of America. Okay, the United States of America.
But, you know, to return to the theme of the conference, of course, that is, you know, one of the challenges involved in trying to address this issue in a democratic society, right? I mean, in China, you probably don't have these discussions, right? They have their Chinese firewall, right? And in Russia too, they're, you know, preparing work so that they can disconnect from the entire internet. Or a country like Turkey, you know, they have, you know, which is a bit of a gray area case, whether it's a democracy or not. I mean, in those countries, it's much easier to tackle this issue. And that's why those countries always, you know, I was recently reading this Freedom House makes every year a report on these kind of companies, including countries, I mean, including on internet freedom. And that's why they report China for the 4th year in a row as, you know, the worst country from this perspective, and reporting on Russia that for the 6th year in a row, internet freedom has deteriorated. So it's absolutely very difficult.
But another tool China has used, and this one, it's a little harder to explain, but I think the trends are very clear. And the term that people use for this is Chinese sharp power. Now, are all of you familiar with the concept of soft power, which is what Joe Nye, a Harvard University professor, coined about 30 years ago? And he was trying to explain that a country's influence is not solely based on its military power. That's hard power. But it's based on their soft power, which he defined as the power to attract. So Mickey Mouse is part of our soft power. People love, you know, my second tour in the Foreign Service, I was issuing visas in Osaka. This is before the visa waiver. And 3 officers, we issued 200,000 visas to Japanese travelers going to Hawaii, Guam, and California mostly. And you'd ask people, we didn't interview very many because we're just issuing as fast as we can. But why do you want to go? I want to go to Disneyland. You know, I want to go to this place in Anaheim. And it was great. You know, we're earning a lot of money. All these people are coming and traveling. But they liked the United States because of that aspect of our culture. Now, I'm not just saying Disneyland. It's sort of Hollywood. There's lots of things. But that's what sharp power is. Another less humorous example of our soft power is our university system. Students want to come to the United States to study because they think the United States has a quality university system. And that's part of our power to attract, is that soft power.
So the unifying dynamic of what brings political identity to Americans, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, is different than in other countries. That in many other countries, those political principles may change over time. But really, for what is still a young or middle-aged country, the United States, 200 plus years, to almost 250 years, I guess we're getting close to it. Democracy is so deeply embedded in our national identity that we don't know how to separate the two. In other parts of the world, they are separable, I think. So I think we have to just reflect a little bit about whether we have such an assumption about the virtues of democracy and the fundamental intersection of good governance and democratic practice. We have to just pause and say, why is that not completely accepted by the rest of the world? And to just realize, in a way, that it is somewhat distinctively part of the American experience and not necessarily a universal experience.
The leader of the Reichstag delegation said, "Do not mistake us for bourgeois because we will crush your skulls," right? Pushing freedom of speech in order to destroy freedom of speech, debasing the political discourse with violent rhetoric. That's what they did. And my fear is that once these kind of regimes get in power, they don't give it up, okay? Because they're only getting power to destroy the democratic order they're in. They said, class is a mythology. It's the Jew Karl Marx that made you want to think that you're in a class. You are not in a class. This is a conspiracy against us. You are a part of a race. And this is the new identity, right? Disdain for expertise, disdain for science. And when you do these kind of things, the Nazi experiment shows me that if you create a vacuum where there's no expertise and no science, then you fill it with conspiracies and magical thinking and all sorts of mythic things, right, that come into that vacuum.
Well, that, history is a powerful tool in the hands of politicians and can be a destructive weapon, as power over the past is the power to decide who is a hero, who is a traitor, who is a citizen, who is an enemy, all right, who, all right, can be part of your nation, who is excluded from your nation. Therefore, how we tell our historical stories is a very powerful political tool. Tradition, the remembrance of ancestors, experiences of previous generations, are keys that unlock the doors to citizens' minds and allow certain ideas, visions, and political programs to flourish. History can be a political weapon during revolutionary and transitional political processes when the past is decisively divided from the present. The new order and society are founded on the basis of some interpretations of the past, as the new regime seek to utilize historical narratives to talk about the imagined future of the nation.
Chavez reviled the traditional parties as useless, in part because they were useless. He created his own party rather than becoming the candidate for one of the existing parties. He reinvented Venezuelan history. Reinvented Venezuelan history. He glorified the military. Now, almost every country I've ever been in, there's great respect for the military, for good reason. But he glorified the Venezuelan military and military officers as being not just patriotic, but organized, efficient, more capable than ordinary citizens, right? And not corrupt. Not corrupt. But no, there turns out not to be true. We all know that our military, whatever country we're in, reflects us. Our military is no more or less corrupt than we are as a nation, right? Anyhow, okay, let me keep going. He demonized the opposition, the parties he was running against. He denounced the middle class, as, and it's hard to translate, as escuálidos, squalid people, escuálidos. He denounced a large part of the opposition, because this was the middle class, is los hijos de los inmigrantes europeos, the children of European immigrants. They're not real Venezuelans, even though they've been here for 2 generations. They are the children of European immigrants who are oppressing us. He attacked the media. That sound familiar? as being unfair to him, campaigning against him. And then he gets elected president. So he's elected president for the first time in 1998, takes office on January 1, 1999. He's inaugurated. And here I have to say, with support of lots of people in the middle class and lots of wealthy business executives who say this new guy is going to be able to solve these problems which the two traditional parties could not do, and we're going to be able to control it. This is all campaign stuff, and once he gets into office, he will act presidential.
But you should bear, in fairness, in mind the scale at which these companies operate, right? I mean, Facebook by now is at 2 billion users, monthly active users worldwide. 2 billion. That's a lot of people. Twitter, 300 million, slightly over. 200 billion tweets are being sent per year. So, in fairness, they try to enforce some rules. Mistakes are being made. They got picked up in the media, and guys like me make fun of them. But it's a very hard task that they're doing. Also, YouTube, for instance, almost 2 billion users. Every minute, there's 400 hours of video being uploaded. Every minute. So, I mean, we're talking about issues at the huge scale, which of course also means that the challenges are very considerable indeed.
The new authoritarianism rests on tying their predecessors' illegitimacy to some extent to the ascent of women's power or the ascent of other groups' power. And in each case, efforts to denigrate and subordinate women cemented for their supporters the belief that the nation, having been turned upside down as a result of, again, the emancipation of women in public spaces, or as I say, or the national other, all right, is that now these authoritarian regimes are turning history right side up once again.
Her view is what resonates, I think, with President Trump, that in the end, if you want to do business with us, and I think what he finds very attractive, and this is where the danger of authoritarianism is that it's more efficient than democracy. You only have to talk to one guy. That one guy can make a decision. He doesn't have to tell you, well, it'll take me 6 months to get the parliament to debate, and we'll have to reach out to citizens and see how they feel about this. Democracy is messy. Democracy is slow. And what I see that Trump is very drawn to is this, wanting to know that there's an authority that can make decisions and move things along.
And then finally, the last area in which I'm concerned about Chinese influence in Asia, and this is a little more like the Cold War, although I don't want to exaggerate this too much, but China as an alternative model. And clearly, one of the challenges with democracies is they're not the most efficient way of getting things done. I mean, democracy requires hearing lots of points of view, talking about things, reaching compromise. That's not easy, it's hard. And the Chinese are basically saying, we don't need democracy. We're growing at 12% a year. We're very efficient. We get things done. Wouldn't you rather get things done rather than have this messy democratic system? And I'm not saying they're out there proselytizing, but countries are looking at and wondering if they're frustrated with their democratic government, maybe there is a better way of doing business. To be honest, that's kind of how Singapore does it. They're a city state. They're not really a major country. So I wouldn't say this is like a communism versus capitalism kind of a struggle, but rather, I think on the one hand, you have China, whose goal is to weaken US influence in the region because they want a near abroad that's stable and not tied to the United States. So you have that. And then you have what's been pretty successful in China in terms of their economic growth. And you can't deny what they've done in the last 40 years. It's been pretty remarkable. You've had, I think, 300 million people moved out of poverty. More than half of the people in the world who've moved out of poverty since 1950 live in China. So they're the most successful developing country in terms of the economics.
So both on the good side, the democratic countries are the countries that created what we call the liberal world order that is also under stress right now. But the dark side of it is that authoritarian regimes at home that becomes part of their foreign policy. And we certainly see the authoritarians feeling comfortable with each other and that they think they can perhaps offer an alternative world order, that the assumptions of the liberal world order that were created after World War II, very largely under American leadership, the creation of the United Nations, the belief in cooperative and collective security, all these concepts were supposed to make democratic states the leaders of an order that was intended to serve the interests of citizens that were not living in democracies yet, but perhaps over time would move in the direction of progress and towards that aspirational goal of democracy. So I think the countries that were always a little bit skeptical about the liberal world order, they didn't like the emphasis on individual rights and liberties and the sort of responsibility of the individual. Those countries are now realigning their own foreign policies to so that there's this convergence of how they behave at home and how they want to behave in the international space.
The United States, 327 million people, a $20 trillion economy. If you want to hear a critique of human rights in the United States, go to the Freedom House website. Mike Abramowitz, who's the president of Freedom House, he starts out saying, just as we've called out foreign leaders for undermining democratic norms in their countries, we must draw the same attention to the same sorts of warning signs in our own country.
Let me get back to the general trends of democracy and decline. Ambassador Shapiro talked about Freedom House, and it really is an excellent resource. If you are interested in democracies in the world, go to Freedom House's website. They do an annual survey, and they just came out with their 2018 survey. What interests me, though, is not so much the ratings, like where does the US rank on this list, or where does Venezuela rank? It can be a little arbitrary. They have a very complex formula, and they look at a lot of different criteria. But what to me is the most interesting is they've been doing this for a long time now. And so rather than a snapshot, what happened in 2018, if you look at the movie version, the flow, how has it changed over time? Because they're using the same criteria every year, I think you can get a sense of trends. And if you look at Freedom House's reports over time, it's not been a pretty picture for the last 13 years. They've said that for the last 13 consecutive years, there has been a decline in global freedom and backsliding among new democracies in particular. So not a very pleasant thing. Their overview is called Democracy in Retreat, the Global Erosion of Democratic Norms. And they have a lot of data. For example, elections. Over the past 4 years, electoral processes have declined more than any other measure of freedom. And elections are a pretty critical part of democracy. They talk about freedom of expression, which they said has been in decline for the last 13 years, but in the last 6 years, an even steeper downturn in that decline. They particularly express alarm about what they call digital authoritarianism, attempts to control what people have access to on the internet.
While focused on 2 examples out of post-communist Europe, the examples that I point out this morning can be applied to different parts of the world, different cultures and different political systems, allowing us to think about how history is remembered and forgotten, how governments' remembrance policies are used to create a new citizenry and new sensibilities, to change a previous political culture, and to justify a vision of society promoted by new ruling elites.
Is that I think we see these values these proclivities beginning to reappear. And I think I'd suggest in conclusion that you don't need a Nazi regime, a fascist regime, to have fascist politics. And what I think we're seeing in many different places is a kind of recrudescence of this fascist way of doing things as an alternative to liberal democracy. We used to have a consensus about the Nazis for my entire lifetime, that this was unmitigated evil. And with the internet and other technologies, strangely enough, that consensus is eroding away. And now there are powerful forces in the world that think this should be emulated because of the problems of the contemporary world.
So today we live in a world for a variety of reasons, a shift in American leadership, redistribution of power and wealth in the international system, the power of media that can be promoting untruths as much as truths. We are in a world where the authoritarians are feeling more confident. They are not feeling that the United States either will punish them or can punish them. And the collective consequence of this is a weakening of the liberal world order. Now, one thing that Kagan acknowledges is that the liberalism per se doesn't have answers to human needs for family, tribe, culture. That liberalism allows people to be so individualistic that some of these more traditional organizing principles of society are given less attention and less respect. So he realizes, and the new authoritarians, I think, play very much on this. So we know, and this is not anything that will be new, that this yearning for this sense of belonging to some kind of community, whether it's your religious community or ethnic or geographic community, et cetera, is still a very powerful human instinct, and the authoritarians have used this to great effect.
Well, as I mentioned before, that FIDES has established reliable historical institutes that are dedicated to this new politics of memory, okay? That in the last 5 years, there have been raging debates about really who controls history, and that those types of institutes that existed prior to FIDES, that perhaps one could argue presented a more kind of objective scientific historical inquiry, that these now have been under siege and new institutes with political appointees, all right, have emerged, all right? Well, that in conjunction with these types of what I've just said is that, and described, that these were the first salvos of a campaign in politics to rewrite the country's national history and to demonstrate a new form of authoritarianism. This authoritarianism bears many of the classic motives and logic of its earlier kin. However, people, in fact, are not controlled through fear alone, but primarily through a shaping of the public discourse to suit authoritarian needs.
We believe also, we've been raised on the notion that one of America's roles in the world is to promote democracy, is to share that we represent a more enlightened form of governance, and that we are not in a necessarily arrogant or colonial or patronizing way, but that it is part of America's mission to spread the virtues of democracy around the world. So I think we also have, most of us have internalized in our own educations that exceptionalism of America is one of the positive roles that we play in the world. That we're a model, that we're the shining city on the hill, that we are the people that has inspired revolutions and political movements in so many countries. For us, for many Americans, for most Americans, I believe, that was always seen as one of America's purposes, that we're not just democratic at home, but that we promote democratic virtues and values around the world. It's clear that today we are at a moment where that debate, we are re-debating that proposition. We are re-debating whether it is an American responsibility or purpose to promote democracy. Is democracy the thing that America has to share and offer to the world? But I found that, it is true. We are not a pure Athenian democracy. Our system is, when we created the balance between the House and the Senate, when our founding fathers created the Electoral College, it's a weighted system. It's power invested in a small group, an elite that will then represent the people. It is not really one man, one vote. And so that's true. That's a factual reality, that we don't have pure democracy in this country. But I find it both very disturbing, but perhaps at some level reassuring that the state of Michigan is redebating this. So what are the officials doing? They are holding a series of meetings, conversations around the state to try to decide how to either adapt, refine, amend, revise the civics education curriculum. So it's just a small example of how alive these issues are. We are going back to foundational principles of what is American political system, what's the preferred form of governance in this country, and I believe that the America First and that there is a dark side to this. There is an assumption that that power should be invested in the hands of a few who can make decisions for the many. So we are really back to very basic ideas of the choices that were made in the creating of this republic, and whether we are still confident about our democratic practices and our democratic system of government.
Because the national project was initially defined by men and almost immediately became a masculine project, women's citizenship in the state and women's place in the nation have, in its nationalist context, been constructed in relation to men's. Thus, women, through their symbolic, moral, and biological reproduction, have often been portrayed as supporting the nation's creation, and rarely as its creators, founders, or geniuses. And all you have to do now is to walk through the public spaces of any of the various kind of post-socialist states or authoritarian states and take a look at who is in their public squares and who is being commemorated.
And Hitler said, "I'll put an end to the idea that a woman's body belongs to her." Okay? I was reading Hitler's table discussions in preparation for this, and it's shocking all over again.
So here I just want to put on the table two words that I think we need to weave into our analysis: information and institutions. So, I think there's no doubt that, and every talk that is ever given can start with this point, that in the information, internet, social media environment has profoundly changed concepts of politics and individual empowerment, mostly for good, but not entirely. And I teach in one of my courses about this decline of respect for expertise, and that the democratization of access to information has had unexpected costs and consequences. It has weakened people's respect for institutions. It has weakened because people believe that they can become instant experts and they don't need the experts anymore. But in truth, the concept of Republican government depends on an electorate being informed enough to pick the right representatives, and that those representatives have to rely on science and common sense and the public good to make the choices they make. With this democratization and this polarization of information net communities and hubs, we have eroded unintentionally, I think, the old system, which was that institutions were supposed to reflect knowledge that was created for the public good. So let me just put those two words
But
out.
I think our role in those places is to help these countries chart a future on their own terms. They have to decide what kind of government they want, but I'm confident that they will want greater freedom, greater openness, and greater democracy. So we have to help countries have the space to define their own destinies while gradually becoming more prosperous, more economically open, more independent, and more democratic. Now, the challenge, and again, Ambassador Shapiro made this point, this requires patience, and we're not good at patience in the United States, I must say. So that's a challenge we have. We can be practical. We also, I think, have an idealistic streak, which is important when you're talking about democracy, but we must be patient. We're playing the long game, not the short game there. I want to leave on a slightly more optimistic note and talk about what can we do, because I think there are things that democracies can do. So in case anyone's about to drop off to sleep, let me now give you the summary of what I'm going to say here. And if you only take that away, I'll be happy. So the summary is yes. That's it. One word, yes. Okay, yes to what? Well, the yes is to the question, can democracy meet the challenge? And I think the answer to that very clearly is yes, we can. However, there's another question that we really need to look at, and that is, will democracy meet the challenge? That's a harder one to answer, and I don't have an unequivocal yes to that. But I do want to get to, can democracy meet the challenge, and why do I think yes, we can, if we have the will to do so?
It's estimated that roughly 70% of Europeans use social media. I guess that it's at least that number here in the US. If you look, for instance, at the most popular websites in the US, 6 out of the top 10 websites are based on social media or user-generated content. So that also illustrates how popular that is. To go back to the political dimension, of course, I think there's well documented cases of use of social media for the Arabic Spring, for instance, or actually any given uprising, or the Orange Revolutions in Ukraine. They typically rely heavily on social media for the organizers to get involved and to exercise their political activities. So there can be a little question about the importance of social media. And then my third point that you see on the slide is it's the modern public square. That's a quote from your Supreme Court, who has from the very beginning been pretty enthusiastic about the internet in general and social media in particular. And I always think that reading Supreme Court judgments, the Supreme Court has kind of a nice way of putting things compared to our courts, at least. Back in 1997, they already referred to the vast democratic forums of the internet, saying that anyone can become a town crier with a voice that resonates farther than it could from any soapbox. And just 2 years ago, the Supreme Court also pointed to social media's relatively unlimited, low-cost capacity for communication of all kinds, allowing users to engage in a wide array of protected First Amendment activity on topics as diverse as human thought. And that, I think, is absolutely correct and really well put.
So those are the, 8 things that I recommend that the United States government do when I say, yes, democracies can meet the challenge. But also, I'm going to leave you with 2 challenges, things you can do as well. And the first one, and this really is important, and I even, now that I'm retired, it's easy to say, but even when I was in government, I believe this: communicate with your elected officials. It really matters. It makes a big difference. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Japan and Korea, I can't count the number of times I had Korean American groups coming in and talking to me about some aspect of US policy that they either did or didn't like. And usually I was the one delegated to do it because all the political appointees were too busy. But it was important. And my father was a civics teacher. He had taught me how you should be engaged. So I always was respectful. But I actually learned a lot from a lot of these organizations. I once had a group of 7 mothers, Korean American mothers from the New York Korean PTA Association, who came down to me to talk about how they didn't like our school textbooks and how we called it the Sea of Japan. They wanted to call it the East Sea, which is the Korean term. And I spent an hour talking to them and explaining and so forth. And they were unhappy with my answer. But I told them, I'm glad you were here. And come back, because an engaged citizenry is what makes a democracy work. And we want people supporting foreign policy.
Important shift, though, between, I put the dates of those policy documents. An important shift between April and December 2018 is that we're much more honest now about addressing the Russian issue. When we made this communication in April, it was like, ooh, can we mention Russia? And, I think we settled on a compromise, our political leaders settled on a compromise saying a big country in the East that starts with an R, whereas this action plan is like, Russia is a bad guy in this sense, and we need to do something about it at the state level. And that is kind of the point here I want to make, is that you can do all kind of things when it comes to the platforms, ensure transparency, who's fake, try to tackle the bots and the fake accounts, etc., and educate people and all of that. And that's definitely important. It's part of the answer, but part of the answer, I think, is also, it's just one tool in the toolbox, and there are other tools such as old-fashioned diplomacy or sanctions and other means, because this is very much a geopolitical issue, very much unlike the issues that I was discussing earlier.
So I think our task is to still keep up our confidence that this focus on individual rights that is so embedded in both democracy and in the liberal order can still be reconciled with effective governance. We have to make sure that our institutions can deliver. We have to look for political candidates that actually want to get things done, not just stand in unrealistic rhetorical positions, in my view. We have to demonstrate that liberal institutions can still deliver the goods, deliver services. And we also, in my view, have to demand for a more engaged role of the United States in the world. The new isolationism that is implicit in America First is a threat not only to what remains of the liberal world order, but will have consequences for the quality of democratic values and behavior at home.